Hey class, welcome back to our history subject. And again, we're getting into our American Revolution book. And today we'll be covering chapter 16. So if you haven't read chapters 1 through 15, make sure you go back and do those. And also remember to participate in the big question discussion posts for each chapter and also complete the chapter vocabulary. With that, with the chapter vocabulary, please use the definitions that you find in the book so that I know that you are getting in the book and using those definitions, not copy and paste a definition from Google or from somewhere else. And then also with the big question discussion post, please don't copy and paste an answer. Please use your own words. So in chapter 15, we were talking about how the American Revolution War, the Revolutionary War, has started, but kind of started off on a rocky foot for the Americans. The British had all these trained soldiers. They had a lot of Native Americans and African Americans helping them on their side. Didn't have a lot of men. They were losing people. The Minutemen, the military in for the American colonies was just people that were volunteering, not people that were trained. A lot of them were farmers, and a lot of them couldn't spend a whole lot of time fighting. They had other responsibilities, and so they could only, join for a short amount of time. We learned about how women helped the war and how they were, providing support and getting things done and ready for the soldiers so that they could have food, clothes, and be able to fight better. So in chapter 16, we're going to be talking about the rising American spirits. So through this chapter, we have our primary focus objectives, things that we want to be able to come away with from this chapter. And there's 3 of them. The first one is to understand Washington's plan for winning the war. So he's making a plan how they're going to win, how they're going to separate from the mother country and get independence. We'll be able to explain the events of the battles of Trenton and Princeton and their significance. Why were they important? And then, as always, be able to understand the chapter vocabulary words. I'm just going to check my notes really quick. So far we have learned about both the Continental and the British armies. And so which side do you think is more likely to win at this point? From what we've read so far, do you think, if you were to kind of step back and not think about, the history and, knowing the outcome, right? Just looking at the situation at that time, if you were in that moment, who do you think would have won? Do you think the Continental Army would have come out on top, or do you think the British just were too strong and powerful? So again, what do you think? If you were back there in the 1700s, either fighting in the war or helping out or being around, do you think the Americans actually would have pulled out the victory? So during this chapter, we're going to read about 2 battles of the American Revolution that will help us answer this question. So now let's call attention to the big question and let's look for reasons why Washington's strategy required patience, okay, as we read. So the big question, what is meant by the statement, Washington's plan for winning the war required patience? So let's look for reasons why the plan required patience. Now let's start reading and follow along with me. An early British victory. Things went badly for the Continental Army during the early part of the war. Hardly 3 months after Americans celebrated the Declaration of Independence, a large British army assembled in New York City to do battle with Washington's still untrained army. Remember, they were just mostly farmers, people that were volunteering, not trained soldiers like the British. The British defeated the Continental Army easily. It almost trapped them. That might have ended the war then and there. Led by Washington, however, some of the American forces escaped. It was during that battle for New York City that a 24-year-old Connecticut schoolteacher named Nathan Hale became famous. Hale was caught serving as a spy for the Americans, and he was hanged by the British. His last words were, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." His words inspired the patriots. All right, let's pause really quick, and that's our first vocabulary word. Inspired or inspire. Now let's read this together. To cause someone to think or behave in a certain way. His words are still quoted today. So he inspired people. He inspired people to become patriots, meaning to fight for their country, to defend their country, to become united as the colonies, right? So we've talked about how the colonies at first were kind of just separate, kind of individual groups, but now through this process, they become more united and have become Americans. Let's take a second to look at this cool painting, and then we'll scroll down and read the caption together. Okay, so Nathan Hale was executed by the British for spying for the Americans. This looks like this could have been at the execution, and maybe his wife, family members, people that loved him are crying and upset and sad about what just happened. All right. After the Continental Army's narrow escape from New York, the Americans retreated across New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. The British stayed close behind. Luckily, it was getting late in the year. Winter was a hard time to fight battles. The British were satisfied to take control of New York and New Jersey and settle in for the winter. They could finish off the Americans in the spring. No rush right now. It was at this moment that Washington's leadership began to pay off. Other generals might have panicked after such a setback, but not Washington. So they've been losing a lot of men. They've been losing battles. Washington still had hope and determination, and it wasn't going to set him back. Whether he won a battle or lost, he remained steady. Soldiers admired him and were willing to follow him into battle. He had good influence, right? We just talked about how Nathan Hale inspired people to become patriots. Well, Washington inspired soldiers to continue to go into battle. Battle, however, was not what Washington wanted. He knew his untrained troops were no match for the experienced British army head on in battle. So head on, like right in front of each other, the way that battles usually took place, where they would line up and fight. The normal way, the head on in battle, wasn't going to work. So Washington needed a plan. Washington's plan for winning the war required patience. Now we're getting to our big question, so let's pay attention. Instead of taking on the British directly, head on, Washington's strategy was like Thomas Paine's checkerboard. He would keep the Continental Army moving. They would stop and fight the British now and then, but they would not get into a major battle. This way, Washington could buy time to build and train his army. So, why did his plan require patience? We just talked about a huge component, right? A head-on battle would happen really quick, be over really fast, but he wanted to move and continue to move, fight a little bit, and then continue to move to buy time so that he could train and probably gather more people to join the army. Washington's plan meant the Continental Army would not win many battles. They wouldn't lose many battles either. Meanwhile, as the war went on, the British people might tire of paying for it. After a few big American victories, who knew, maybe the British would stop supporting the war altogether. Next section, a surprise attack. Okay, so before we read what happened to Nathan Hale, he was someone that inspired patriotism. What happened to him? Well, he was caught as a spy, and then he was hung by the British. Okay, let's continue. A surprise attack. Washington realized that the American people could tire of the war too. So could his army. If it kept suffering defeats, Washington needed a quick victory or two to raise the spirits of his soldiers and the rest of the nation. Washington planned a surprise attack on British mercenaries. The soldiers the British hired from other countries. So people that weren't from Britain, but were hired to support and help with the British army. These are mercenaries. The mercenaries were called Hessians because many came from the German state of Hesse or Hesse. Might not be pronouncing that right. Sorry, guys. All right, so that's our next vocabulary phrase, German state. Now read this with me, Elena. One of several small independent states that eventually made up the present-day country of Germany. Haitians. So the Haitians were camped in Trenton, New Jersey, just across the Delaware River from Pennsylvania. Washington planned to take on the Haitians by surprise. After all, Who would suspect the Continental Army to row across the ice-filled Delaware River in the dead of winter? Let's pause really quick. You guys remember Principal Hillock showing the great painting of Washington crossing the Delaware? If you do, that's awesome, because now you can kind of get a picture in your head of what it was like. So on Christmas night, 1776, shivering American soldiers stepped into the rowboats that would carry them across the river. By 4 o'clock in the morning, all 2,400 or 2,400 of Washington's men were on the New Jersey side of the river. So, I was wondering how long that took. They got there by 4 o'clock in the morning. They left some day on Christmas night, and then the next day they got there. Maybe it was, yeah, it doesn't say. The Continental Army marched the 9 miles of Trenton, hidden by the darkness of night. As day broke, they attacked the sleeping Haitians. Caught off guard, the Haitians were surprised and confused. After a short fight, 900 of them surrendered. It's a lot of mercenaries. And then here is the picture of Washington and the troops crossing the Delaware, this ice filled. You can see that they're pushing away all this ice. Emmanuel Leutz of Washington crossing the Delaware. The Continental Army captured not only the enemy soldiers, but also their weapons and supplies. 8 days later, Washington won another victory. Again, he used the element of surprise, this time to defeat British soldiers in Princeton, New Jersey. Just as Washington hoped, the victories at Trenton and Princeton raised American spirits, especially for the men fighting in the Continental Army. So not only did they have patience with trying to fight, fighting a little bit and then moving around and then fighting a little bit more, they also had to have this great patience to take this long trip to cross the Delaware and then to hike the 9 miles. Is that correct? Do I remember that correct? Yep, 9 miles to Trenton, right? So 9 miles on foot is not easy. And the dark, right? So patience to believe in his troops, patience as a army to make that sacrifice and to cross the Delaware and hike at night. Those surprise attacks and those patience paid off. And so those are some hints to help you with your big question. And that is it for chapter 16, Raising America's Spirits. And that will be it. And I will see you guys in the next lesson.